Hello, and welcome to League of Josh podcast. My name is Joshua, and I'm your host. This episode was recorded on June 21st, 2021. Today I have with me Latu'ila. In this episode, we discuss cancel culture and the emergent issue that appears to be infiltrating everyday conversation. We bounce from self-censorship in interpersonal relationships to corporate censorship over COVID vaccine safety and alternative treatments. We also delve into the evolving language of racism, as well as the importance of culture, and whether or not white culture exists. To me, the current exploratory climate looks like a toxic relationship. We are actively dissuaded from addressing our disputes with each other and having open dialogue in good faith. So often I'm wrong about things. It is imperative to me that I have conversations with a diverse array of opinions so that as a group we may come one step closer to some form of truth. Under the topic of COVID vaccine safety discussed in this episode, I'm hopeful that I'm wrong and would be so elated to profess my painful ignorance. I'm equally horrified that what I say might be right. I hope that this episode can encourage you to have difficult discussions on important matters in your own life. We must be afforded the luxury to discuss important ideas poorly, lest we do not say anything of importance at all. Hello everyone, today I'm going to be talking with Latu'ila. Anyone that listens regularly would know that Tyler is my most repeated guest, and for good reasons. Tyler offers a nuanced and diverse perspective to any topic that presents itself during the conversation and is always open to critiquing not only me, but also himself. It is something that I look up to him for greatly and strive to integrate into my own conversational style. Recently, Tyler launched his own podcast, THALIDOMIDE. Definitely go check it out when you're through with this. I expect Tyler to deliver top quality, as always. Tyler, man, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks, man. Third time, I guess, on the show.
You are
awesome.
My by far most repeated guest, so you hold that trophy.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, definitely not upset about that. Can you tell me about your podcast? Let's start off with that.
Yeah, dude.
Why'd you start the podcast? Where did it come from? What does THALIDOMIDE mean? Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, THALIDOMIDE. You did fine.
Yeah.
A podcast is something I always want to do. I think everyone kind of talks about it. Everyone talks about, let's start a business, let's start a podcast. Actually, me and Chris Kaiser back in when it was, I think the first year Regan Fathers was overseas and he came back for Christmas. So it would have been 2 years ago. And we started a podcast. We recorded one episode with Regan. And the idea of that podcast was to be us to chat with like people we've played against in the ACAC and just talk shit about, like we compete against each other on the net and just kind of converse about stuff that happened. And when we talked with Regan, he got into some stuff. There was a little rivalry between him and what's the guy from Lethbridge? Dax Whitehead.
Yeah.
And it was kind of juicy, like gossipy stuff. And I think we still have the recording. I might even just put it up. But we didn't continue with it. Just didn't happen. Anyways, fast forward this past year, I met a guy, Raymond Fox, and then River Thomas. River played volleyball at Olds. I think he still does. Two Indigenous guys. I met them through the UBIAA, which me and you have chatted about before. But they started a podcast and it went off. Like they had some pretty big guests on quite early. It was huge, especially in the Indigenous community. Later on, they decided to start a kind of a media company and reached out to some people to start a podcast. And this was back in, I want to say February. And I said, like, man, I'm in, maybe I'll do one with this girl and this guy. And he was like, nah, man, like you need to do this yourself. You're just using them as crutches. They're not going to be as dedicated as you are. I know you want to do this. And I was like, you're right, man. I appreciate you giving me that little kick in the ass. But yeah, it just took a few months for me to actually have the time, because I'm sure it takes a lot of time to recording itself is, whatever, but cutting it up, even just getting stuff onto Spotify and Apple is a bit of a process too. So yeah, man, always wanted to do it. The name Talanoa just came to me as soon as I was thinking of a name. So in Pacific culture, like, I'm Tongan myself, Talanoa has no direct translation. But for example, a random night, me and my brothers were like, hey, let's go over to our cousin Lola's house for Talanoa. And it's quite a common thing in collectivist cultures. You just go to that person's house, you sit around and you talk. Tala means, literal translation is talk or say or tell. And then Noa actually means nothing, literally means nothing or zero. Mm-hmm. So loosely translates to talking about nothing, but is also used in, in a cultural sense for storytelling, oral tradition of passing things down. So yeah, right away that came to me. That's going to be the name. And similar to what you do, man, you just sit around, you talk, and you bounce ideas off each other, and yeah.
So are you sticking to long form? I listened to your first episode and it didn't sound like you would cut it up at all. It was really good. I enjoyed it a lot. It was cool to get a little bit of an inkling into the Tunga tradition, and especially the tattoo part was very cool. I'm not sure if that's actually Tunga, but
yeah. So Nehemiah Mote was my first guest, and we actually played with each other for the New South Wales team way back before he is the captain of the Wallaroos now.
Unbelievable.
Crazy story. And that episode was great because he was just good at telling stories. But I was actually super nervous the whole time, and it was a little more interviewee than conversational, which is what you live and you learn, right? So yeah, I was looking at cutting it up, and then when I listened back to it, I was like, there's nothing here that I can cut out, man. This is all good stuff. So I think I'm just going to see how it goes, but most likely, yeah, it'll be long form, not trying to cut too much stuff out unless someone says some dumb shit. I don't want anyone to get canceled on my podcast.
I've been listening. I'm having a girl on next week, and her name's Emma, and she does the Curious One podcast, and I've been listening to it over the past few weeks, and she does a little bit of cutting, and I would just love it if they weren't cut, because they'll start to talk about something and then it'll cut out a little bit and then it'll just jump to another part of the conversation. And I love to hear how the conversation actually flows. And I love to hear people mess up when they're having a conversation. Even when I listen back to my own podcast, I love listening to the ums and the likes and all of those things. That not only do they help me get better at speaking, but hearing other people do it also gives me confidence that I'm not the only one that's messing up all the time.
Well, there's something beautiful about it, man. And so I listened to your episode with Taylor Averill, and it was just supernatural, not supernatural, but it was very natural. You know what I mean? And it was nice to just, it sounded like two bros just talking, but about some pretty cool stuff. And, most of the time people are listening to podcasts, they're kind of doing something else while they're listening. So the ability to be able to kind of tune out and tune back in, instead of like, if you cut everything into a condensed length, I kind of have to listen to everything in there because it's all such important stuff, So yeah, I like that.
I did. Have you ever heard of Train Ugly or the Learner Lab?
No.
It's this guy, Trevor Reagan. I had him on. I talked to him earlier this week, and he does that. He essentially does long form conversations with all of these experts in learning. So they talk about neuroplasticity and storytelling and all this super cool stuff. And then they cut it down to this 20-minute episode where they talk about the concepts and then they add in clips from the individual interviews. And I've got to sit down for those. I sit down and listen because it's just all so dense. And yeah, like you said, it's really nice to listen to something and not have the pressure to be focused on it the entire time. It's so difficult to do that. And yeah, I find that those are, I think that my episode with Taylor might be one of my favorites because it really feels like a conversation. Sometimes when I do these, there's not as much back and forth. It's more of it's more unilateral. I'm just asking questions and then they give a full answer. And then I ask a question based on that answer. So it's just question, rather than something that you and I do as well, I think, is we consistently move back and forth in terms of speaking and listening. And it doesn't feel as though I'm waiting for you to finish to talk again. I'm just listening, taking everything in. And then often I listen to our other episode, or the second episode that we did this morning. And there are some points where one of us will finish speaking, and then there'll be a break for 4 or 5 seconds, because I think that, number one, we're giving each other the space to maybe flesh out a thought completely. But then also, it's when you're really listening to someone and you really aren't waiting for your turn to speak, when they finish speaking, it's almost a little bit of a surprise. You go, oh, it's my turn to talk. Like, I don't have much prepared. That was really awesome. I was just listening to that, and now I'm the spotlight's on me. So I find those conversations to be just my absolute favorite.
Yeah, I haven't listened to either of the podcasts that I've been on with you, because it's so hard for me to hear myself talk. Or also, the last episode that we did was all around race and stuff, and it's super uncomfortable stuff. And I think we both kind of felt it, but we're both also moving towards not conclusions, but we're both generating ideas and bouncing things off each other as well. So yeah, I've never been back and listened to them. Taylor was awesome, like from the start. Which is cool, because I mean, he's a pretty high profile volleyball player, and from the get-go he was just like, yo, what's up with you? But it was awesome, man. I got to get him on too.
I sent him a message and said, hey man, do you want to do a podcast? # you won't, because that's kind of his thing. All of the stuff he posts, he does these crazy workouts, and then he says, you won't. Like, oh, you might, but you won't. So I sent him that, and he was immediately, we just got along. We just hit it off. He was like, my man, yep, when are we doing this? Let's schedule it. Let's go. So that was, if you're going to try to get him on, that's definitely the recommendation.
I might have to do it, yeah.
Yeah, he was just a sweet guy, just super open. And yeah, I hadn't listened to mine and yours like, I can't really listen to myself speak either. I've actually gotten better at it. Speeding up the video or the audio actually makes it a lot easier to listen to myself. But that's why I decided to do full length when I first started, was because editing and cutting stuff killed me. And then I realized that it was actually a lot more fun to do full length, because people were able to hear and understand the errors that people make. And you actually get the flow of the conversation a lot better. It doesn't feel as broken up conversationally. You're jumping from one thing to another. You can understand the flow. So that was definitely the reason that I did that. But I listened to it, and I didn't actually, when I put it out, I was super anxious. You know that I get super anxious talking about that kind of stuff. Any cultural stuff. That's even something that I want to talk about today, is why we get so anxious about speaking about those sorts of things. But I was anxious for probably a week and a half. I was waiting for the mobs to show up at my door down here. So, but I listened to it, and I didn't think that we actually said anything that was over and above what would be considered to be correct. And anything that we did talk about, there was always, I think anytime that I went a little bit too far, maybe, you were always there to bring it back a little bit and say, hey, well, let's consider this for a second. And let's consider that, and let's take these different perspectives and actually weigh them against each other so that we can find some middle ground. There's this really cool Buddhist story that I think perfectly encapsulates the idea of speaking about any of these cultural issues. And so Buddha gathers this group of wise men, and they're all very old, very wise, and very blind. And so he puts them all together, and then the Buddha goes off, and then the blind men feel this thing. They find this thing in the middle of their group, and they're all touching it. They're trying to figure out what it is. And one of them says, it's a paintbrush. And another one says, no, this is a pillar. We're outside of a coliseum, and this is a pillar. Then another guy says, no, this is a hose. Another guy says, no, we're on a sail ship. This is a sail. And the Buddha comes back, and they're all fighting because each one of them thinks that their own perspective is correct. And one's screaming at the other guy, no, this is a paintbrush. We're in an art gallery. No, we're in a coliseum. No, we're on a ship. No, this is a hose. We're in a village. And Buddha comes back and says, why are you guys all touching the elephant?
Yeah.
And so everyone's looking at it from a different perspective, and they're unable to see things or interpret things from another perspective because nobody's moving around. Nobody's trying to move around to get a different perspective on things. And a really good example of this that I heard was those really insane street art, where if you stand in one place, it's this super three-dimensional street art where you have this giant hole into hell, or there's like a giant ocean beneath you and all the concrete's all cracked up. But if you move anywhere outside of this individual spot that lets you see the art, you see how distorted it all is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's what ends up happening within these conversations is people get so siloed that you're just stuck in this position, and then you end up yelling at other people rather than being able to actually take in their perspective and try to add to your own perspective. And it's something that I find just so, I think it's really emotionally difficult as well to move through perspectives, because I go on TikTok, which I think is somewhat toxic because there's not enough time to actually have discussion between people. And it turns out to be, the TikToks are essentially, no, you're wrong, let me show you why. And then at the end, another, no, you're wrong, so fuck off. And that's what the whole video is. And going through them, I actually listen to different perspectives and I go, yeah, that's right, definitely, that's absolutely right. But you have to be looking at it from a very particular perspective to have that idea as right. And then I also think about my perspective and how to be right for myself, I'm actually in my own perspective. And so to incorporate all of these other perspectives essentially just let me know that I'm wrong the majority of the time, which is why I enjoy having conversations with you, is because we can actually break down ideas and move through them in a very open and free communication lens.
And last summer, you know, the conversations I'm in and everything, I was really mad at white people. And it's not like I'm mad at you or I'm mad at my buddy or anything. Mm-hmm. And it's a weird concept that it was definitely, I was mad at the system that gives privilege to certain groups, yada, yada. But that doesn't really it's not really visible. It's not something you can see. So I was out in BC, and I'm on the ferry going to the Victoria. I see all these huge mansions on these islands, and knowing what I know about colonization and stuff, I'm just so mad at these people for having that. You know what I mean? Like, mm-hmm. This was not even someone else's land. There were other people who took care of this land, and now it's been turned into this, you know. And I don't want to say whose family I was with, but I was with a white family just past weekend, and such loving, caring people, but also just like some of the most racist shit being said at the table. And it's like, it's such a complex, like, some of these ideas are exactly what I was protesting for against last summer. And at the same time, really loving, caring people have these ideas, and being able to separate the ideas someone has, their values, all these different things is, I just got back, so I'm still processing it all, and it is it's very complex, man. And like you said, if you're only, you know, if I was only at one table having the conversations at one table, I could be really mad at everything else. But now that I'm sitting at these different tables, which again is another interesting thing, because I wonder if I was just a little darker, you know, talked a little more different, you know, would these things still be happening around me? Or would I be hearing these things as comfortably as they're saying them, if that makes sense?
Yeah, you're a little bit of a secret agent.
Yeah, man. And I've always had that. It's funny being mixed race. My mom's white, my dad's Tongan. In some instances, a lot of the time it was like I was the white guy with my Tongan family, and then I was the Tongan guy with my white family. And then on the other end, I feel that also I can relate to almost anyone that I talk to through experience. So it is a unique position to be in.
That point that you just made about feeling like the Tongan person with your white family and the white person with your Tongan family, that I read a few months ago now. It's called The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. And he was the first PhD Harvard graduate.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
He was the first Black PhD Harvard graduate. And it's essentially the sociological journey through the South as it emerged from slavery. And he's going through as a teacher and recounting the things that had happened to these families and why they were in this state of perpetual poverty. And a point that he makes early on in the book is that the Black community is often in a purgatory between the decision of being Black and living and being American, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that really struck me. And I'm still not sure exactly why that struck me, but it really hit me deep. And I'm still trying to figure out why that hit me so deep, and maybe why in my personal ignorance I feel that there shouldn't be as much of a disconnect between those two. But I understand that there is a disconnect between those two, and I would love to hear your perspective on that, because that's something that, like I said, I'm still trying to work through it. I don't understand exactly what that means or why it made me feel the way that it did.
Yeah, so Ivermectin, the best book, I read it, I finished reading it right before we chatted, and I was like, I need to talk to someone about this. And it was what's it called? Stamped from the Beginning. One of the best books I've ever read. And he has it follows 5 people through history from the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade to Barack Obama. And yeah, he has it follows 5 different people. I think the second guy is W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's quite heavy reading, so I don't remember everything from it, but you get a lot of ideas from it. But yeah, Du Bois talked about this duality between being Black and being American. And in some of the conversations we had with the UBIAA, we had a couple Indigenous guys speaking, and one of them was saying, I struggle between, he's on the volleyball team at Old, saying, like, I struggle holding on to my Indigenous identity, and then I guess you would say Canadian. Mm-hmm. And ideally, yes, we would like to be both, or they would like to be one and be comfortable within each other. But being Indigenous in Canada, how can you be proud to be Canadian or be comfortable in that when it's still not okay or safe to do that in our society? Mm-hmm. Growing up in New Zealand, it's interesting being in Canada where people have no prejudice against Polynesians or Pacific Islanders, because there's just none here. So when I meet people, they're kind of like, what are you? Like, are you Spanish? Or, you know what I mean? Whereas growing up in New Zealand, I went to a white middle school. And if you saw it, you probably think it was a private school. We had gray uniforms. You pull your socks up to your knees. If they weren't up, we had this deputy principal, man, Mr. Crumpton, and he would scream at you if your socks weren't up. And you used to put like an elastic band underneath the sock and then fold it over the top so that it wouldn't fall down. Mr. Crumpton, I think he's still there, and I really hope he's calmed down, because that was not good for his blood pressure, man.
That's such a totalitarian name.
It was nuts.
Mr. Crumpton.
Mr. Crumpton, yeah. He was British too. And so, I mean, honestly, by, let's just say, Calgary standards, that school is pretty diverse, but still majority white and in a quite nice area of Auckland. And I always would try to make a point that I wasn't like those other islanders. You know, I would try to speak more white and, you know, even put down islanders. I have big legs, like I have big calves, big quads, and I always wanted my legs to be skinny, like the white boys. I thought it looked better. You know, it's just, it's weird, man. And then I went to Penrose High School, which is like a decile 2 school. If you were white, you were in the heavy minority. Like, yeah, mostly islanders. Then we had a lot of South Asians, all types. And then I had to stop being so white because I was getting beaten up. You know, little different in New Zealand. You know, the duality, I think, in the States and with Canada. Actually, no, the Māori in New Zealand have all very similar stories, Indigenous peoples across the world. So, yeah, it's tough. I think we talked about it too. You hardly ever see an Indigenous person in Canada with a Canadian flag, you know, unless they played for Canada. Mm-hmm. It's like how that flag for an Indigenous person here just represents so much more than national pride. How can you be proud of that? Now we have all these children turning up in mass graves that Indigenous people have been talking about, or have known. Now we've just have some statistics to go with it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I definitely think that as it stands, the idea of patriotism as an Indigenous person, they're very conflicting ideologies. As you said, how are you patriotic of a colonial inquisition that came in and created or orchestrated mass genocides, and particularly of the Indigenous youth? That, yeah, you're the 215 in Kamloops. I'm not sure what the other ones are, but I know that there are a lot of investigations going on that are going to turn up far more as the time goes on. So I think that that's something that we really have to, I just think there has to be conversation around that as well. There has to be conversation between those two. I talked to Dalton Sinoski, and he's a Métis teacher out of Saskatchewan, and something that we touched on a little bit towards the end is the civilization that we live in right now is likely one of the freest that's ever existed, and particularly in Canada, and I mean North America in general, Europe, but there's no outright slavery. Slavery's been around since the beginning of humankind, essentially, and we live in a very free time, and we're the wealthiest that humans have ever been, and there are all these things that are going so well for us, and at the same time there are these things that they're horrible historic atrocities and ongoing oppression that continues to impact groups of people, which it's tough to talk about those two in the same vein. It's tough to say we're some of the luckiest human beings to exist right now in the place that we exist, and also there are these horrible things that have happened, and we have to reconcile that, and we have to come to terms with those issues, and we have to have an open discussion about them, and we have to educate people on them. And I think that so often people just throw themselves into one of those two groups. Either everything's great, shut up, and horrible things have happened and continue to happen, and nothing is good. I'm going to try this again. There was a poem that I tried to read off when I was having my conversation with Dalton, and I'll try to do it again. It's by Charles Dickens, and it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, it was a season of darkness. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that the noisiest of its authorities insisted on its being perceived for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. And I think that that perfectly encapsulates the zeitgeist that we live in right now, where people are on either side of that. And as you said in our last discussion, there's no touching of the circles of ideology right now. We're not at a Venn diagram. We're circles on either side of a spectrum. And I think a big part of that might be language, which is something that I wanted to touch on a little bit today, and the language that we use and how it's evolving potentially faster than the emotion can catch up with it.
It's funny that you brought up the state that we're in today, because I had a buddy over, and we have really, just like you and I do, I just moved to Toronto. I've been here for a few months, and in Greece I had a guy who, no matter what topic we were talking about, he would always take the other side and we would debate, and I just loved it.
Yeah.
And it's a little different here. My buddy Pierre, we have differing opinions on things, and we just debate it out, and we're not going against each other. We're also just trying to just go somewhere. We're just going somewhere with it. You know what I mean? And I think we were talking about, I don't know, some marginalized group. Pick one. That's what we're talking about. And he's like, well, you got to think that we're better off now than ever been before. And I was like, sure, but I'm never going to be satisfied with that. And he's like, you're right. We need both of those frames of thought. And yeah, you got to be grateful for where we're at, but you just can't be satisfied with it. And Joe Rogan had Dave Chappelle on, and I fucking love Dave Chappelle, man. Rogan said the same thing. Like, hey man, we're better. I think Steve Pinker says or something, where, we're, in terms of all these things, we're better off than we've ever been. Mm-hmm. And Dave Chappelle was like, yeah, but there were people that got us there. It didn't just happen.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And whether or not me or you do something today is probably still going to trend that way, but there are important people that made it happen. So
totally. I think it's like any healthy relationship with a friend. Your friend might have come from the worst place ever, and now they're just totally thriving. You don't want your friend to stop. You don't want your friend to just plateau. Okay, you're doing great. That's it. Stop. You want your friend to keep going. And I think a lot of that increase, or the consistent improvement, comes from the peaks and valleys that we experience. Mm-hmm. You have to have some bad days to have good days. That's just how life goes. And I think that might be a part of this whole thing, is accepting the good and the bad days. And one thing that I'm having a guy on later this week to talk about cancel culture and what it means. And the general idea that I've been trying to play with is, what if we're wrong? What if there are things that we're wrong about? And by canceling voices, by canceling perspectives, we're actually taking those out of the playing field and making things far worse for ourselves in the long run, because the momentary uncomfortability of changing our perspective on things it's so easy to throw those away now. And we have one common perspective, one common narrative. And if anything deviates from that, we're so quick to throw it away as insane, anti-science, racist, any of those things. And what if those ideas are actually the things that could elevate us to bring us to a higher place? And so that's something that I'm very concerned about, especially as of late. I've been following the lab leak hypothesis / vaccine safety versus different means of treating for COVID or preventing COVID. And it seems more and more that the things that were 6 months, a year, a week ago, the things that were crazy anti-science are potentially the things that are also right. And now we're having to recorrect in such a drastic manner that what's the cost of all that? I think that's the inevitable question that comes along with what if we're wrong, is what is the cost? How many lives is it worth? How many trillions of dollars is it going to be worth? Because trillions of dollars also equals quality of life for lots of people. So I think those are the questions that I've been trying to wrestle with lately. And I definitely think that you're one of the people that can help to bring a nuanced perspective to those for me.
Yeah, man. What is, so you mentioned some COVID related stuff. What are some things that you've seen that are coming back and like we were wrong?
Yeah. So the lab leak hypothesis is one thing and I think that definitely lab leak hypothesis, not lab leak theory, not proven at all. There still needs to be way more investigation to go into this. But
and sorry, that's that it came from that lab in Wuhan, right?
Yeah. So there are two gain of function research labs in the world. One of them being in Wuhan, the other one being in America. And the idea that this virus likely came out of that lab because number one, we haven't been able to find any natural, like a natural origin.
Mm-hmm. And
that the fact that it was just immediately taken off the table as a hypothesis is frightening enough. Mm-hmm. And the fact that it's now turning around and saying, well, this is actually quite likely. And regardless of who's responsible for this, I don't think that matters as much as the understanding of we're essentially souping up super viruses. And there's obviously not a lot of regulation on that. So the fact that that's happening is actually the key problem. It's not who did this, what do they owe us, any of that bullshit. I don't care about that. It's we're creating things that could potentially destroy an entire global economy, because that's what we have now, and we have to deal with that. We have a global economy, and it can destroy a global economy, ruin lives for millions of people, kill millions of people, actually probably ruin the lives of billions of people in terms of economics, and then kill millions of people. So we're doing this. Now we have to come to terms with that and speak to each other honestly about what we're going to do about that. Is it worth it? Maybe, possibly. How do we move forward with that? So that's my perspective on that, is we actually have to have a reasonable conversation regarding what the safety is of this, whether it's worth it. And all of that comes from just a place of honesty. Are we willing to have a discussion about this thing? And are we willing to put every hypothesis onto the table and then eliminate them as they are fit to eliminate? Or are we willing to say, no, this thing's completely wrong. We're not going to test it. We're not going to look into it. Totally wrong. Get it out of here. So I think that's one thing that worries me. Another one is so there's a prophylactic called Ivermectin, and it was found in the microbiome of soil in Japan. And what ivermectin does is, so it's a prophylactic, so it's something that you use to negate being infected by a virus. And it's been used in Africa to treat river blindness for the past 40 years. And the places where it is used in Africa have far lower COVID mortality rates. And I'll put all of the websites to this in the show notes so that I actually have something backing me up. But it seems to be that this is safe, number one, because it has a history of over 40 years. So we know that it's not going to have long-term impacts down the road. I suspect that this will probably get pulled off of YouTube, because it's part of the YouTube guidelines that you can't mention ivermectin in terms of treating COVID. Yeah. So, and then there are also these charts of the point at which ivermectin becomes available to the broader society. And the death rate and infection rate just nosedives. It's unbelievable seeing these things. So there's potential that this thing is able to treat or help so that people don't contract COVID in the first place. And if they do contract COVID, the long-term damage is significant. Another thing is, I think that the left and the right argue this point far more, but vaccine safety versus COVID damage. And number one, I'm so pro vaccines, it's not even funny. I have more vaccines than I would guess that most people have. Like, I've been to Southeast Asia, didn't ask a question, just put that into my arm, let's go. The fact that this is a newer technology and people are touting that it's safe, whether it actually harms in the long term is a different question from it being safe. And so I think, number one, you don't want COVID. I think that that's going to have long-term impacts because of what it does to the respiratory system and the damage it causes in the respiratory system. I would suspect over the next 40 years, the rates of COPD in the elderly populations is going to skyrocket. Number one, because of vapes. So that's something that we would maybe have to control for, but also the damage that COVID does on body tissue. So you don't want COVID. You don't want to risk getting COVID. That's still something that I'm pretty confident about. And at the same time, we don't really know about vaccine safety, especially with a new vaccine with a novel technology. I think this is the deadliest vaccine we've ever distributed. I think this vaccine has more deaths in 6 months than any other vaccine in the past 30 years, or all vaccines in the past 30 years. I think that might be it. I will link to a big article where a guy puts all of this data together. And essentially nobody will talk about these things. As I said with ivermectin, it's being censored on YouTube. So that's part of the issue, is what happens if we're wrong about these things. And I might be wrong. I would be so willing to admit that I'm wrong. I would actually be unbelievably happy to admit that I'm wrong about these things if I am wrong about these things down the road. But what if we're not wrong? And by limiting people's availability to information and limiting free speech, we're actually digging ourselves into a hole. And I don't know, I've looked through history 1 or 2 times and I can't find any instance where large scale censorship has turned out well.
Yeah. So the lab leak, I watched a video from The Economist on YouTube, and they were talking about it too, and that a big reason that it wasn't looked into more was because of the racist comments Trump was making. You know, this is a China virus, yada yada. Mm-hmm. And you're kind of right about this cancel culture stuff, or, you know, that's one instance where in the intention not to offend anyone, we became almost anti-scientific. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And that is definitely one huge backfire from all this too. And that we try our best, or I try my best to think critically, but you have your biases and you have your intuition, which is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, in terms of sport, in terms of everything. What is intuitive? What do I do without really thinking? And what am I actually processing and thinking about? Any of these conversations, it is really hard. Even when you're starting to talk about vaccine stuff, I can even just feel myself naturally being like, is he an anti-vaxxer? Like, do we have to go? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it is. I feel it too.
Yeah,
like I'm saying it and I feel it.
Yeah, and it's really hard to separate the emotion from it. That's just human, though.
Mm-hmm. And you hit on a really good point there. Number one, the lab leak being nuked because Trump believed it, and Trump was talking about the China virus. And that's one thing that I think that the term I read How to Be an Anti-Racist, and I thought Kendi did a good job at presenting ideas and moving through them. I definitely think that he's in his own place, and I thought there were a few things that I didn't like. I thought there were things that I liked. There were things that I didn't like. One of the things that I didn't like was
let's hear it.
The idea of racism being totally black and white,
mm-hmm.
And even I haven't heard a lot about this, but Tom Hanks being more or less canceled for not being anti-racist enough, not being racist, but not also being anti-racist. So that idea of a dichotomy between something being totally racist or not racist, and the evolution of the term racist, I think, has evolved in writing faster than it's evolved in emotion. So this idea that the idea that Trump's saying this is like the Chinese virus, I don't think that that's racist. And that's something that I actually really wanted to ask you about, because we talked last time we discussed that idea of language and the left and the right just not having the same language at all. They say the same things. They're saying this is racist, and then so let's say MSNBC says this is racist, and then Fox says that's not racist, that's crazy. And I actually wanted to know what your perspective was on that, because I thought what Kendi did from a psychological perspective was a little bit short-sighted, because that is such a significant word in our language, and the history behind that word is so significant. It's the same with, I'm going to use the word because I feel that it's important, but the word fag. So in junior high, whatever, my friends and I would call each other that. That was just a part of what we were doing. And it wasn't disparaging gay people. It was saying, you suck. You're the worst. I wasn't telling my friend that he was a homosexual. I was saying, you suck. And as a culture, we didn't move fast enough out of what the history of that word was. And now I haven't heard that word besides me saying it, I haven't heard that word in like 10 years.
Dude, I heard it a lot over this week.
Really?
No, I just told you I went on a little trip.
Yeah.
I was with, and it hit me, man. I was like, whoa.
Even saying it, I get uncomfortable. Like
I used to fling this word around like that, and it's crazy that, now I feel that way. Yeah.
Right. Well, so I'm curious, were you disparaging your friends for being homosexuals?
When I was younger?
Mm-hmm.
No, but it's like calling someone a pussy. What are you saying? They have a vagina and that they're a woman, and then that's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. This is how I do the steps, and it's kind of the same thing using that word. Like, mm-hmm. What is the origin? You're saying someone's like being gay. You know what I mean? Oh, that's gay. Like, what it comes down to with a lot of these things is intention and outcome. And was your intention to be homophobic? No, but if a gay person was around, which they often were, and were in the closet, and a huge reason was because of that behavior and that talk, just because your intention doesn't mean that it didn't have a huge outcome for someone. I think just being straight and just fling that around is so easy for us, but it has such a big impact on someone else's entire life. One thing I struggled with, and I still struggle with, Kendi's definitions, is that it is totally outcome based. And this is a total philosophical question and stuff, but basically, from my understanding, is that anything that has an outcome of racial inequity is racist, is how he kind of redefined the term. Mm-hmm. So if you look at Trump calling it the China virus, like we have the Spanish flu, and I don't think it even started in Spain.
It did not.
I mean, yeah. So, okay. Surface level, is it calling it the Chinese virus or the China virus racist? No. But a lot of the outcome, a lot of what happened after that, and what we're still seeing is a lot of anti-Asian hate and abuse. And I can't see that not being amplified. It might have happened anyway, but Trump using that term surely amplified that hate and that abuse and that racism. So I don't know. My initial reaction, my intuitive reaction was that's racist, and not because of that small speck, that thing he said, but Trump is a racist. Mm-hmm. So it's hard for me to remove that, him saying these things when he is a proven racist. You know what I mean?
Right. Okay. So, and then like, sorry for throwing so much stuff at you. I know that this
no, dude, I'm open to it. There are
Perfect.
people who, Don't worry.
Yeah. So that's what I'm trying to figure out is when. Let me recount the point you're making and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm liable to be. But regardless of what the actual statement is, sometimes there are consequences derived from that statement, which inevitably turn out to be racist in action. Mm-hmm. So in that example, Trump saying the Chinese virus after there's a large spike in anti-Asian hate crime. And so because of the inevitable consequence, then that initial statement turns out to be racist. And that's what I'm trying to figure out is whether there's another term to be used, because the term racist has such significant connotations to it. It's similar to what we talked about with Robin DiAngelo, where in her book, White Fragility, if you walk into a room and tell every single white person that they're inherently racist because of the society we've been raised in and born into, I would consider myself to be a pretty open-minded person, and I don't know, I don't want to go off on myself, but if someone calls me a racist, I'm instantly on my toes. I'm pulled back. It's that similar emotional reaction to the F word that I said earlier. Like, it makes me tighten up inside because when I think of racism, I think of redlining, Jim Crow, lynching, and to be thrown into that because of the color of my skin as a white person, that makes me tense up a lot. And I'd love to know your perspective on that, and whether I'm being fragile.
Yes and no. But to your point, I guess doing that can hurt the cause, right? If you're just going to do that and say that, hey, you're white, you're racist. I guess outcome based probably is less likely to get that person in on the movement. But when you try, like, I wouldn't even bother trying to tell that to. It's a nice problem to have.
Yeah.
As a white person, is what I'm trying to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yeah, when you get on this, like, hey, they have it worse, but then these people have it even worse. And then when you mix these intersections, they have it. A big thing I got from our last talk was that we need to be working together, and the language. The language is really important, man. The word racist is very loaded and has changed over time. To DiAngelo and Kendi's points, I guess we definitely do need to redefine the word, and I think words get redefined all the time. They evolve just as we do. And interesting, you talking earlier that things evolve differently through writing than they do through us actually saying them.
Mm-hmm.
And do we need a new word? Oh, that's an idea. A big part of anti-racism, though, is being comfortable calling things racist. Even Candy says, I don't call them microaggressions anymore. I just call them racial abuse. I call it for what it is. Yeah, maybe when you're coupling huge things like Jim Crow and then smaller things, definitely smaller things, in the workplace, and you put them all in the same umbrella term, maybe that hurts the cause too. I don't know.
Well, that's what I've been thinking about this for a long time because, as I said, there's an emotional gravity to a word, and the word racist is like the sun right now.
Yeah,
that word has a lot of, and I totally understand. I think that is something to the credit of D'Angelo and Kendi, is that I don't think we have a word to. I don't think we have a word that properly describes the feeling that should maybe be encapsulated when people feel microaggressions, or they feel subjugated in the workplace, or they feel as if they're a marginalized person. Because, as I said, microaggressions and lynching, to me, when you put those into the umbrella of racist, if someone calls me a racist for a microaggression that maybe I'm not aware of, then, as I said, I feel that deep tightening within my stomach, and I go, whoa, that's a big word. That's a really big word. And I think that also happens with words like systemic. I've been trying to think a lot about whether I believe that racism is systemic, and I think that there are issues that we deal with in society that maybe not even issues, because, God, what's the best way to put this? One of the ideas with Kendi as it being black and white, and if there's not equity in outcome, so everyone garners the same outcome, then it must be racist policy. I think that idea I think there's just so much nuance to that. One argument that I heard was the average age of African Americans, black people, is about 27. And the average age of white people is around 40 something. So the idea that there's more wealth within the white community would make sense from that perspective. The older you get, the more wealthy you get. Also, the fact that the majority of professional basketball players are black, that also makes sense from that perspective. And so I don't think either of those are inherently racist ideas. I think that there is a discrepancy. If you control for everything, dig really deep down, I do think that white people have an inherent privilege of a few percent. And so I think that's something definitely to address, but to paint everything if there's no equity in outcome, to paint that as systemic racism I think that really piggybacks on the term racism, because systemic would insist that it's central. It is a part of the society inherently. And the argument that I'm trying to make is that I think that it's more towards the extremities of society that there's racism. And whether there's racism within individuals, within humans, I couldn't disagree. I see racism all the time, not just towards black people from white people, but I also see it in my brown friends and my black friends. I think that there's lots of racism to go around. And what I've been more concerned with is disparity and discrimination. That's something that I'm a little bit more focused on now, is how do we figure that out rather than racism? Because racism isn't that's in someone's mind. I can't really reach into someone's head and pull that out.
Yeah, and this the individual stuff, people's views and opinions. I'm not really. I mean, you know how hard it would be to just go to every person and The people in my direct circle, though, yeah, I will probably put effort into that if I'm seeing them, my family, that sort of thing. Or I'll find a new circle. But I struggle to see racism not being systemic, based on the history of, let's just say, North America. And so the argument is, a lot of the arguments, I listened to, what's his name? He's on Rogan a lot. He's Jewish.
Weinstein?
The younger guy, talks real fast, conservative.
Tim Pool. Oh, Ben Shapiro.
Ben Shapiro. And I like to listen to guys like that because they have complete different views from me. Mm-hmm. And I like to argue with them by myself in my head. And yeah, that's what we do. You and I pretty well, I think. Mm-hmm. One of his arguments was that we're at a point where everything is equal opportunity-wise. What do we need to do moving forward? I just can't see that. I don't see that in our society, and I just don't think one of his things is we got to stop talking about the past and just go on to the future. Like, yes, there's places for you to talk about it, but I don't want to hear it. What do we have to do to move forward? But I mean, redlining wasn't that long ago. Jim Crow wasn't that long ago. Those were part of the system. Yes, they're gone now, but probably the biggest system in place would be in America, mass incarceration of Black men.
Yeah.
And, you can put that on. I will say I do struggle with Kendi's binaries, whether you call them false binaries or not. So I do struggle with saying, if you're not anti-racist, then you're racist, because by doing nothing, you're participating in a system that of white supremacy, basically. And I think that's kind of a fundamental philosophical argument, whether you agree with that or not. I don't know what I think of that. I think I'm biased towards agreeing with it. But yeah, but then again, you're just changing the definition of the term. Mm-hmm. And I just went on a total tangent. I forgot what we were talking about.
You had brought up Ben Shapiro I was talking about systemic racism, because my perspective is that it's a little bit towards the fringes of society rather than right in the center of everything.
Well, so North America, from the beginning of colonization, has been created. Our society, the way we live, has been created around whiteness. So the closer in proximity you are to whiteness, the more likely you are to be what our society defines as successful. Mm-hmm. So if you live in a collectivist culture, which is a lot of people of color, you're less likely to succeed. I think you're less. Let's take coaching, for example. Mm-hmm. When you coach, when I coach white kids in Calgary, I know they have a bit of money because I know what they pay for these bloody camps, right? Some of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, particularly in Calgary. They love when you kind of, hey, Josh did great today. You see he was killing balls, like, you're the player of the day, yada, yada. Awesome, clap. I want to do that. I want to be more individualist, right? If you do that, I coached with Dallas and Chris up in Northern Ontario in a remote reserve. And you can't do that with those kids because they get embarrassed. Like, you're singling me out from the collective now. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And you can see kids, and this is the same in a lot of indigenous cultures. When you do that, you might see over the next couple of days that kid will purposely underperform to not be singled out like that again. So just kind of to that point of systemic, the current system that we are in, which is a hard thing to visualize, it doesn't look like anything, really rewards you for being as close as you can to whiteness. And so that's how I struggle with it not being systemic, is if you're not participating in that, then you are much less likely to succeed.
Very interesting with the collectivist groups being actually embarrassed. If you get a piece of paper and you give it to someone in the collective society and you ask them to lay out a web of the people in their lives and their significance by drawing bigger circle for someone that's more significant, very rarely will they put themselves into the center. Whereas if you do that with someone from an individualistic culture, they'll put themselves in the center right away, big circle. So I find that very interesting that was something that you observed. And something you said towards the end there was the idea of individuality being more propped up by the idea of whiteness. And that's something that I've also been thinking a lot about lately, is what does whiteness mean? Because I've heard that a ton. This is white, things, being on time, math, studying, all of those being ideas of white culture. And so tell me if I'm wrong and just comment on this, but your idea is that whiteness is actually or individualistic society is inherently derived from white culture.
Yeah, good question. From what I know, where else do you see it?
Individual society?
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah,
Great question.
And actually talking to my buddy, same buddy who we kind of debate, and he's Afghan. His parents immigrated here from Afghanistan a while ago. And you'll hear this a lot from immigrant parents of color. You're becoming white. He's super into his job. He's quite successful, moving his way up. And his dad's like, whiteness is, I don't think you can take it too literally. It is an idea. Mm-hmm. But what does whiteness mean to, let's just say, an indigenous person? Before white people came, everyone was brown. Colonization happened, and the whiter it got, the worse it got for them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Brought in, stripped them, cultural genocide, residential schools, took them from their land, gave them barren land, said, yeah, these are your reserves. I know from personal experience, so my point is, a big part of whiteness is loss of culture. And I'd love to talk to you about, do white people have culture and stuff too? That'd be a fun little tangent to go on. But a tough thing I know for my dad, who's Tongan, raised in Tonga, moved to Australia when he was 18 on a scholarship, had me at 19 with my mom. I now have an Anglo-Saxon name. I don't speak our language. There's other reasons that come of that, but definitely my dad, in Tongan we say Balangi. Anyone, my own family in Tonga will be like, Balangi, come here. Balangi means, it's like, what's the Mexican word for a white person? Gringo. Yeah. Is gringo offensive? I don't know.
I'm not really bought into all that stuff. So you can call me gringo. I call myself a honky all the time with Landon Curry. Anytime I do something super white, I just call myself a honky.
Yeah. So, it's a huge reason I'm moving back to New Zealand for a bit in September. is to reconnect with my culture. And you know, my girlfriend's white, and you know, we talk about the future, having kids, that sort of thing. And a big important thing for me is for my kids to have a Tongan first name, because even though they probably won't look that Tongan, even just having a Tongan, my last name Latu'ila, pronounced properly Latu'ila, that's still part of my identity. And you know, I've gotten tattoos and stuff, which is more Pacific. When the missionaries came to Tonga, they actually abolished tattooing and a lot of our culture, which is now seeing a resurgence. A lot of Tongans are trying to refine that art and tattoo themselves, but it was all orally passed down, so they're just doing what they think it would look like. Yeah, you know, I want my kids to have Tongan names, and I think that somewhat pushes you towards even just the way people act around you. Like your name's Sione, or your name in Tongan would be Sosiwa. It'd be Siwa. What does that mean? You know, it's, oh, I'm Tongan. You know, I don't look it, but yeah. Sorry, I went off on a tangent again, man. But
No. That's what we're here for. Just diving deep. Well, half the time I have no idea what I'm talking about. So I'm gonna cite a little bit of data for you, and I just want you to tell me what you think about it. There's a UBC psychologist. He died a few years ago, but he was researching Indigenous youth suicide. And I think this might be the 5th time I brought this up on my podcast. So sorry to anyone listening and getting a little bit tired of it, but I think it's, number one, unbelievable, and number two, super important. So Michael J. Chandler was the researcher, and he was looking into Indigenous youth suicide and found that 10% of the bands carried the burden of 90% of Indigenous youth suicide. And the bands, increasingly as the suicide rate got lower and lower, the consistencies between the bands that had few to no suicides were cultural practices such as language, dance, art, some form of self-governance, having a heavier hand within their policing forces, so having their own people do security or things along those lines. And I was trying to figure out for a long time whether culture actually mattered, because when I was younger, I was very, very taken by the communist ideology. I was a total communist, very, very, the furthest left you could go. And that was something that I thought of a lot, because that's a part of the communist doctrine would be to, over time, eliminate religion and eliminate forms of culture. And you end up just having a bunch of people with no culture, and they're all common. And reading this research, I started to understand more and more how much culture actually matters. And I was actually looking into resiliency on the larger scale, and my focus was on Black youth in America and Indigenous youth in Canada, and the factors that contributed to resiliency and later on success. And maybe success would be by me defined within that individualistic culture of being highly educated and having a family, having a complete family that stays together, and having a
golden retriever.
Exactly. Yeah. Little Roger, you have a bandana around his neck. Yeah. So that was my realization, was culture matters far more than anyone would have thought. And it matters a lot. And to your question of whether white people have culture, I think that we're so steeped in it that people don't have individual white culture. So I'm Scottish, Irish, Ukrainian, and I'm a big mutt, but I don't know a lot about those. And something that we were talking about a little bit, actually we talked about this before we started the recording, but being within, my past 2 significant others have had really great family units, and that's something that I missed out on as a child. And so feeling that is a different type of love, and then feeling cultural love is another different type of love that I think that lots of white people miss out on a lot. because you're born into this larger patriotic society, and you don't get to hold on to things as much because you just blend into what everyone else is doing. So I had friends when I was growing up that were my buddy Ryan Notiker. He had big German roots, but they never really celebrated that. And so you feel this tie more to your country than you do to your ancestors, which I think is detrimental in the long term, or even in the short term, no matter how you look at it, because the people that I know that actually have their family history, they know where they came from, who their ancestors were. I think that they have such a deep tie into themselves that, I don't know, I think it gives a lot to people. And I think that you're right. I think that white people don't have cultures outside of their country at large. I mean, if you're American, you're just American. If you're Canadian, you're Canadian. There's no, it's not something that we're trying to hold on to as more minority groups are. I see minority groups that have, they practice their cultural traditions and they hold on to it. They really dig their fingernails into it because it matters. It means something to them, and it should. And I don't think it matters enough to a lot of people, and people that are espousing the idea that we should abolish culture, I think that they don't understand how dangerous that is.
Dude, I really wanted to talk to you about this on my podcast, but I guess we'll just
we'll
no. Yeah. Well, okay. You're a perfect example of this. So I think there are white people in Europe that are, whatever, Irish. I think there's definitely Irish culture, blah, blah, blah. There's always a double-edged sword with racism, and that it also, if this woman, I can't remember her name, but she wrote a book not too long ago, and it was about the myth that racism is a zero-sum game, and that if we stop it for, if Black people stop suffering, then surely that means white people are going to start, right? And that's she writes all these interesting ideas about why that's not true. I listened to Candy on the Armchair podcast, and I forgot who runs that. And he talked about the porn industry and this racist idea that all Black guys have these huge dicks and yada yada, and then that like they're over sexualized, and yeah, that it goes without saying that hurts Black people. But there is also this side effect that a lot of white men feel that they are undersexual and that they can't quote unquote compete with, and I've seen it at SATE where, the guys on my team who I was one of two people of color, the other being Jeff Karras, were just so intimidated by the basketball team on many different levels, but particularly with girls. And so it hurts. It's not a zero-sum game. It hurts both sides. But the idea of whiteness in our society gives you privileges. But the flip side of that is also stripped white people of culture. And I wanted to chat to you because you yearn that as a human being. And I know you went to Asia, and I can't help but kind of couple that with the need for some culture, that yearning. Did you find that there, or did it help you? Am I even on the right train of thought?
You're on. That's such a good question. Number one, that idea is something that I've never thought about before. What the impact of racism is on white people in terms of the loss of culture. That is such a great point, and something that, like I said, I've never come close to thinking about that. So that's amazing. Thanks a lot for that. Jeez.
That's why I'm here, man. Third time, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna be up all night thinking about that one. My mom used to take me to temples when I was young. She wanted to. My grandparents on my dad's side would bring me to church every Sunday, so I'd always went to church every Sunday. And I think in a little bit of in some way to avoid me being solely Christian and brainwashed in the Catholic religion, my mom would take me to lots of different religious sites. So she would take me to temples, and something that I connected with really heavily was Buddhism. And I talk a lot to my friend Randy about this because he is a philosophy English major. So a lot of the philosophy that he's grown up with is Western European, and a lot of the philosophy that I ended up growing up with was Eastern. So I think the way that I actually think and operate is more as a collective individual. So I find myself that there are lots of tests that you can do to see whether you think collectively or individualistically. One of them being, if I were to say monkey, horse, banana, what of those two would you pair?
Monkey and banana. I'm an individualist. Oh God.
I think that actually means collectivist.
Okay.
I think, maybe. Don't quote me on that. It was there were a few of them that I read from Behave by Robert Sapolsky, and so that was one of those. And I actually ended up being far more skewed to the collectivist. And so I think that a part of that is that I was absolutely enthralled by Eastern tradition and Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion. And me going over there, it felt like I was at home. The way that people talked to each other and communicated and talked about ideology. I remember at one point I was in a temple and one of the monks came over and we started talking about this piece of art. And after a while, he kind of looked at me and he started to speak in the native tongue. And I was like, what the hell is happening? And he's like, oh, I thought you were from here. Like there aren't very many white people that actually know about this stuff. We were talking about the auspicious symbols in Buddhism and all these things that are pretty esoteric, and it takes a while to learn about them. And they were things that I just loved, so I knew about them. And so I really felt that was me connecting with my culture. But at the same time, there are tons of other people that are essentially floating through the void without any culture or any inkling of culture, which I think is a big reason as to why lots of people dive so heavily into, I would say it's kind of pseudo Eastern tradition, things like yoga and things that can endow some sense of spirituality and connection to something higher. And I think that's becoming more and more popular in the West because people don't grow up with a larger culture outside of their family. And so they're like, we yearn for it. We want storytellers. And I think that that's something that's also disappeared. I'm talking to arguably one of the best storytellers in the world. He's won tons of storytelling competitions and all these other things. And I'll be talking to him within the next couple of weeks. And that's something that I want to pick his brain about is what's the consequence of losing religion? Because religion is a large umbrella for culture. And that's essentially what Western culture is a offshoot of Judeo-Christianity. And so we're steeped in that, but we also don't have it because we don't have the actual religion to go along with the culture. So now we just have the culture acting out the things that the religion once said. So now we have an action without word. And I think that that's detrimental because without word, without storytelling, where do we find ourselves? Where do we land? And I really think that we're witnessing the death and hopefully rebirth of storytelling. And that's something that I found interesting about Jordan Peterson was his ability to tell stories. And I know him far more as an educator than a political commentator. When I was in my fourth year of university, I was in a personality course, and the teacher that I had was unqualified to teach the course. So I ended up being frustrated, went home, looked up a lecture series for that personality course, and it turned out this random dude that sounded like Kermit the Frog was teaching this course. And so I started listening to it and went, whoa, this is good. This is really good. And then I think 6 months later, a year later, it turns out that this guy, he's been politicized and there's all this controversy going on around him. And it was so strange to me because this dude's just a master storyteller, a master speaker. And obviously tons of people that feel that they've been disenfranchised by society are now going to this man, and he's a father figure for tons of people. And I think that people just hunger for it. I don't think we understand how much we actually want storytelling, how much we want to hear about the intricate underlying of a story. The structure is one thing. The structure is the thing that we really want, but it's the thing on top of that, the thing that we see that brings it to life. And we talked a little bit about movies last time and that form of storytelling. And we talked about how it could potentially be painting a picture for the Black community that is not supportive, because everyone has to be extraordinary. And I think that's something about storytelling that's unbelievably useful, is the call to be extraordinary. And it's something that you almost can't live up to. You can't be Harry Potter. You can't be Samwise Gamgee in Lord of the Rings, carrying some dude up a mountain and throwing the ring into the pit of fire, destroying all evil. But you can strive for it. And I think that's something we've lost.
Dude, maybe that's a big reason podcasts are so popular right now.
Mm-hmm.
We've lost that. We're yearning for that too. And man, that's another thing I can't wait for. Going back to New Zealand is just being with my aunties, uncles, and hearing stories about the islands back when they were growing up. And that's a huge, really important part of my culture is storytelling. How do you get an award for storytelling?
No idea. Can't wait to ask him.
Okay, we'll save that then.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll be good. I'm not sure though, because I know that he's an atheist, but he's working at some kind of church that people from all different religions, they all come to this place and just tell stories, which I think is the coolest concept ever, because you can there's so many different cultures that afford the opportunity to tell different lessons through their storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
I recently read the Bhagavad Gita, which is an old Hindu scripture, and the storytelling it's so complex implicitly, but essentially the whole story is just, so there's Arjuna and he's the head of an army, and then on the other side of the army there's he has family in that army, he has his teachers, he has his family in that army, and him and Sri Krishna, and Krishna is the operating figure of the Godhead, so he's the personality of the Godhead, and they ride their chariot into the middle of these two armies, and essentially at that point the whole world gets put on pause, because Arjuna has to make a decision whether he's willing to kill people on the other side. And Krishna and him have this dialogue, and it's a moralistic dialogue, and it's all in this idea of religion, but all of it's a huge moralistic storytelling. And towards the end there was this really good quote that I liked a lot, and I talked about it with Trevor Reagan a little bit, and it was that which in the beginning is like poison, but in the end is like nectar, and awakens one to self-realization, is said to be happiness in the mode of goodness. And that's such a complex idea. They're talking about sacrifice and what it means to commit to something, giving your time to it, and over time get better at it.
Can you repeat that for me, bro?
Yeah. So that which in the beginning is like poison, and in the end is like nectar, is said to be happiness. Oh, sorry, I'll restart. I missed a part there. That which in the beginning is like poison, but in the end is like nectar, and awakens one to self-realization, is said to be happiness in the mode of goodness. And so I think what that idea is going for is that when you first start off at something, you're going to be bad at it. And as you work towards it, you get better at it. So when you start, it sucks. That's poison. As you work towards that, it gets easier and you get better. And then it's fun. That's that idea of nectar, something that sustains the soul. And by going through that, you actually wake yourself up to what you're capable of. Because so often we quit things right at the beginning once we start them if we're not good at them. And by doing that, you find happiness. And if you're able to put yourself out there and move towards a goal, then that's goodness for the broader scale of things. If you get good at something and you are able to allocate your talents to the people that you love, then that's goodness in the form of society, and it's also happiness in the form of the individual. And so that's a unbelievably complex 4 lines of text if you psychoanalyze that. But at the same time, it's just a part of a story, and this whole story is just full of these things. And I think that's something that we miss out on. I think it's very unfortunate that we don't have that anymore.
That's heavy, man. That my initial reaction to hearing that is volleyball for me. Fuck, dude, I ask myself all the time, why do I play volleyball? Why do I love it? And sometimes I'll go to all the connections I've made, all the people, I've traveled all across the world. I've made insane relationships with people. I've felt all these emotions, all this stuff. And then sometimes I'm like, I just fucking love hitting a volleyball. I just like it. Yeah. Like we always want to put a lot of meaning into things. And then sometimes I'm just like, I just like to ball out on Tuesdays and Saturdays at Woodbine Beach. And that's it. Yeah, man.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hope this helped people. I hope that that our conversations are actually valuable in some way. I definitely think they are.
100%. Yeah.
I think that free and open communication is something that we need, and your willingness to sit down with me and talk about these things just means an absolute ton to me, because I get to work through the outskirts of my understanding of things, and you just blow them wide open and blow my mind every time.
It goes both ways, man. It goes both ways. And a million things I wanted to talk to you about, so we can save it when I have you on.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah.
There was one thing that I wanted to bring up, but I think that we can wait for next time. It's about I think that the way that the Aruna Kiliani story is being handled is actually how I would prefer. So I guess we can talk about that really quickly.
Sure. Yeah.
And hopefully we don't end up going for 6 hours, but I also wouldn't be opposed to that. I'm not doing much today. So I guess I can I don't even have to speak to the audience. I can just catch you up on this. So Aruna Kiliani she has her PhD, and she gave a talk at Yale. And in this lecture, the lecture was called The Psychopathic Problem of the White Mind. And in this lecture, she had a few lines that were questionable at best, and along the lines of one of them being, probably should have written the quotes down, but I'll post a link to Bari Weiss's Substack where she talks about this. And one of them was that she had fantasies about unloading a revolver into the face of a white person and then walking away guilt-free, wiping the blood off her hands. Another one was that all white people are bad apples. And regardless of what I think about what she said, I think that, number one, Yale won't post the lecture, which I think is a little bit of cowardice, because the actual
that's why I can't find it.
So Yale, so there's one person that had it recorded. It's really bad audio. You can't speed it up or anything and listen to it. It's really bad audio. So Yale won't release it, which I find, I don't like that, because the actual lecturer wants it released and she wants a copy of it, but they won't give it to her. Number one, I think that people should be able to listen to this, just understand what's happening in universities and how this is actually a perspective that's taken very seriously. Number two, I think that how it's being handled in the media is how all issues should be handled in the media, where people are having her on and actually letting her discuss her perspective. And she's able to explain what she means, where she's coming from, and whether I agree with her perspective or not, that's one thing. But whether I think that she should have the opportunity to speak about these things, initially I had a reaction which was along the lines of, why is this human being allowed to speak at universities? If you supplement the word white with any other group at all, it's immediately, that's hate speech. I don't know, I think that's crazy. But I think that allowing her to actually talk about her perspective on things, it opens up a whole field of discussion as to how people actually feel about this, how the way that she presents it is that lots of minority groups actually feel this way when they talk to white people. They feel that they are not heard. They feel that they're silenced. They do feel that often the white culture is sociopathic and just steals things. And so I would like that to be the gold standard for how to address these things in the future. Aside from the Yale not releasing it, I think that's reprehensible. I think that the creator of the content should definitely have access to it. And if she wants it posted, it should be posted. But the way that the media is handling things by allowing her to come on and discuss her ideas and essentially explain things, when we have to be allowed to say things poorly in order to get anywhere. And people have to be able to play devil's advocate. That's another thing that I don't like lately, the death of the devil's advocate. When people say this doesn't need a devil's advocate or that doesn't need a devil's advocate. I think that at the deepest root, I think it's a little bit arrogant. And the way that I interpret it is people say, I know so much about this thing and have experienced so much with this that any perspective that you bring to this will inherently be wrong. So I don't want you to speak about it at all. And I do think that people should be able to explain their ideas. And the fact that she's been able to explain this gives me hope that we could potentially expand this to all ideas that we inherently cancel because we don't agree with them. We think that this person's wrong and they should be silenced immediately. I think that people's willingness to actually sit down and have conversations about them, I think that's so much more important. And the fact that we were able to do this with this particular example is somewhat disheartening because of how I think outwardly problematic it would have been for any other group. And I think identifies to me some, gives some kind of hint towards where culture could be going. But at the same time, I think that people's willingness to sit down and talk with her about her ideas, that gives me a lot of hope. I'd like to know what you think about that.
Yeah. So the devil's advocate thing, I agree with you. I think one of the biggest issues was, particularly last summer, people of color were given this quote unquote forum to speak on their experiences. Where did that come from? A lot of it just social pressure, and companies were like, hey, Black people, come, let's chat on a Zoom and tell everyone what you felt. And that's different to what we're having, which is open dialogue.
Right.
And I kind of think of it as someone who's kind of has been stabbed or something, right? They're bleeding out. Like, I was stabbed with a knife and someone was like, I think you were stabbed by a sword. You know what I mean? Like yeah. Just help me. Where there are other people who have opened themselves up to back and forth dialogue, and that's when, man, fucking go for it and debate. But a lot of people aren't ready for that, and it was not communicated to them that that's what it was going to be like when you talk to your experiences. They weren't opening themselves up to debates and stuff. So yeah, you're right. It's just a time and place. It became a bit of a meme. It was, I saw one TikTok and it was like, tell me you're white without saying you're white. And it was a guy like saying, just to play devil's advocate. And it kind of cracked me up. So yeah. The other thing that stood out for me is I don't think I do it too sometimes, where I say, well, if you replaced white with Black, the outcry would be different. But I just don't always think it's not fair to do that, because
they're not equitable. I agree.
Yeah. And I knew you'd agree with that. And the stuff she's saying, I totally understand from what you've told me. I obviously haven't listened to it, but I think I told you right at the start here, like, sometimes I just get so mad, but you're not mad at, like, it's an idea that you're mad at, really.
Yeah.
It's an idea that you're mad at. You're not mad at individual people. You could be. And that's a hard thing to wrap your head around. So just this weekend I was in a tournament, and I'll preface this with, I really want to coach a high performance program one day, and I hope this doesn't kick me in the butt. but we're playing these two kids, these two college age white guys. The parents are watching, and it'd been a long tournament. Anyways, we got into an argument about this guy was screening my partner, and then he's screening me. You can't do that in beach. Mm-hmm. And he starts going, what do you want me to do? It's like, well, it's not up to me to tell you what to do. You're just screening. We're telling you, you and your partner sort it out.
Yeah.
And a huge problem in my life is I have anger issues. It's something I've dealt with since I was born. But nothing, like, I don't think anything sets me off more than entitlement, or like this little smirk on his face that like I can say whatever I want and nothing's going to happen. People who have never been hit in the face before. Yeah. I used to be like that when I was in that middle school. And then I went to Penrose High, and I tried to do that my first month, and I got my ass beat a couple times. Mm-hmm. And he's like, what do you want me to do? Well, you figure out, says it again. What do you want me to do? I'm like, I want you to shut up. And he said, what do you want me to do? I'm like, I told you, I want you to shut up. And he's like, what do you want me to do? Like a little smirk on his face. And my partner, lucky for him, like he said, man, turn around, talk to your partner, you know, whatever. And I'm getting mad. We got into it one more time. And dude, I'm like, I'm 27. These guys are maybe 20 years old, maybe 19. I look like an idiot screaming. And oh, sorry, I missed the whole thing. One point they went at it again, and I said, you privileged little shits think you can come down here and say what you want, like, because there's a net between us. You think I care? Your parents, like, and something came out of me, dude. Like, I was much more mad at something else than this actual situation. Yeah. But it all came out, and my partner's beach partner's Indigenous. And we lost the game. I walked off to get my stuff. I'm like, I'm out of here. I'll wait for my partner. And I saw him chatting with these two guys and the parents. His parents are watching, kind of explaining the whole thing. And so he came back. I'm like, dude, I'm really sorry. Like, I'm really embarrassed right now. And he's like, don't worry about it, man. Don't worry about it. And I'm like, nah, dude, I'm really embarrassed. He's like, I don't think of you any differently. You know, I kind of needed that too. Mm-hmm. And he's like, it's all right, man. Sometimes it's fun to yell at white people. He's like, they're not used to it. I'm like, he just said, you know, Billy's doing coke in his room. Mom comes in. What are you doing? He's like, F off, Mom. I can do what I want. He's like, they're not used to it. And I said, yeah. You know, that's a joke. I understand.
Yeah.
You get it, what I mean.
Yeah.
And I'm driving back. Toronto traffic is insane. I'm like, no one mess with me on my way home, please. And I'm pulling up almost at my apartment. It's pretty heavy traffic. The lane next to me was cut off, no left turn. We're in a bunch of traffic. This dude drives all the way past all the cars, knowing he couldn't turn left, and pulls up, and I'm the second car next to the red. And his passenger asked the guy in front of me, can I go in front of you? And the guy's like, no. The passenger gets out of the car and stands in front of his car, like, you're letting me past. And that was it. I'm like, you're the guy. And I like, get the fuck back in your car, you idiot. You dipshit. Get the back. I don't know if he heard me. He got back in. Light goes green. Guy in front of me drives, says, just go ahead. And they go, no, you go. So he drives off. I try to go, and the guy cuts me off. I'm like, oh my God, man. So when we crossed the intersection, I rammed him. Like, very, very, like, nothing, no dent, no nothing. I don't know if I should be telling the story, but whatever. And he's like, are you okay, man? Like, I'm like, get the fuck back in your car. And he saw it on my face, looking, and I'm the whole time we're in traffic, I'm like, you better not do anything. Like, just please. I'm like in my head, like, please don't do anything, because I'm gonna lose my mind. And he didn't. And I came home, came back to my girlfriend. But the point of the story is, there are situations where you get much madder about something a lot bigger, and context does come into play in our language and how you act. And I made assumptions about these kids that they're privileged kids that have never had their ass beaten. Maybe they were MMA fighters and we're laughing like this dude with his tattoos and stuff. I'll knock him out. Tangent again, man. I'm sorry, but
no, that's fine. I think you bring up a really good point that she was able to explain when she was given the opportunity, was that she's not talking about all white people. She doesn't think that all white people are sociopaths. She thinks that it's part of the culture at large. And that's something that you kind of touch on, is there's a culture, there's a way that we perceive groups, and then there are the individuals within those groups. And what I've experienced is that anytime that you break down those barriers of group identity, when you sit down with an individual, that's all they are. Like, that person
100%.
is just a person. And so I think that's the perfect example for that idea, that everyone should have the opportunity to explain what's going on in their life, in their mind, be able to be afforded the opportunity to say things poorly so that we can get to a higher area of resolution. And I definitely would not hope for you to be arrested in that situation. In that exact same way, I would hate for people to get canceled because of things that they say poorly or off the cuff. And that's kind of that's my thesis for this. Regardless of what that woman said, regardless of how I took that personally or how I think that should be perceived in academia, are irrelevant. The fact that she was able to actually explain the way that she thought, I think, is the way that we should be handling a lot more of these issues.
It should be. One of the bigger problems is that who are the gatekeepers and who gets to decide what is right and what gets released, who gets to decide who's banned off Twitter. It's popular to ban Trump, so let's do it, whether or not that was the right thing or not. I mean, legally, totally, they're a private entity, and these universities, a university should be the place where ideas can be challenged, these sorts of things can happen. It's higher education, right? So yeah, if this could be handled like that, and it ties into the whole cancel culture that you're alluding to before as well. Who gets to decide? And it's all social pressure. Oh man.
And that's to tie things back to my original point about ivermectin and vaccine safety. What if we're not right? That's I think the scariest question that I could pose to anyone who's out to cancel someone or thinks that someone should be deplatformed because of the way that they think, or the group that identifies with them rather than the group that they identify with, is what if we're wrong? What's the cost of being wrong in this situation? And it could be a couple thousand lives, could be a couple million. We're not sure. We're never sure. But the ability to speak and have long form conversation like this seems to be a good alternative to people being silenced.
Well, YouTube's taking us down, man. So you got to switch to Vimeo or something.
There's Bret Weinstein actually just switched to Odyssey.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to be switching. I'm going to be posting on both, and hopefully moving towards Odyssey more in the future. Any platform that doesn't do censorship is one that I'm in favor of.
Oh.
Yeah. All right. Let's cut it there, Tyler, man.
All right, man.
Always a pleasure. I always dig way deeper. I probably made an ass of myself several times. I hope that I'm forgiven by the cancel masses for that, and nobody shows up at my door with their pitchforks and torches. And yeah.
Hashtag don't cancel Josh. Don't cancel League of Josh, please.
Yeah. We'll get a couple more episodes out. Man, thanks a lot. Where can people find you? Yeah, so on Instagram is Talanoa, TALANOA .podcast. And then, just Talanoa podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Killer. Can't wait for the next few episodes, man. Can't wait to make my guest appearance.
Appreciate you, man.